There is a moment, in the discipline of a king's guard, when the whole of his training tells him one thing and the whole of his heart tells him another. And in that moment, a man learns what he is actually made of. Mine came on a gray morning in the dead of winter, on the frozen edge of the long water at Harrowgate Palace, with a child's voice cracking the silence and the ice going out from under a boy who should never have been allowed to walk so far from the bank. I will tell it plainly because I have heard it told 100 ways since, and most of those tellings have made me into something I am not. They have made me a hero. I am not a hero. I am a guardsman of the Royal House of Harrowgate, in the service of the Kingdom of Eldermoor, and on that morning I did the only thing a man with a heart in his chest could do. And then I spent the longest weeks of my life paying for it before the Prince-Consort, with his own 2 hands, set the matter right in a way I will carry to my grave. But I am ahead of myself. Let me stand you where I stood. My name is Edmund Vance. At the time of which I speak, I was 41 years old and had stood the Queen's posts for 19 of them. I had begun as a boy of 22, fresh from the line regiments, with a chest that had not yet learned to be still, and a chin that had not yet learned to be silent. The guard had taught me both. Stillness is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you ever truly master. You learn to stand at the south gate through a summer that bakes the wool of your tunic to your back, and through a winter that turns the brass of your buttons to ice against your chest, and you learn that the not moving is not emptiness. It is a kind of holding. You are holding the line that says, here is order, here is the realm, here is a thing that does not flinch. People walk past you and think you are a statue. You are not a statue. A statue feels nothing. I felt everything. I had simply learned to let none of it reach my face. 19 years of that, and I had never once broken my post, not for a fainting tourist in the August crowds. Not for a man who shouted insults at me for the better part of an hour to win a bet with his friends. Not for a woman who pressed a lit cigarette against the back of my glove to see if I would jump. I had stood while the realm mourned old Queen Aldreda, the present Queen's grandmother, and I had stood while the bells rang for the birth of the Princess Maelin. And through all of it, the only thing that ever moved was the slow turn of the seasons across the forecourt stones. That was the man I was. I tell you this not to boast of it, but so that you understand what it cost, and how little I cared for the cost, when the line finally broke. The morning was the 8th of the frost month. I remember it because the household had been preparing for 3 days for the winter reception, which the House of Harrowgate holds each year on the Long Water, the ornamental lake that runs the length of the East Gardens, below the terraces, hard up against the old stone of the palace's eastern face. In a deep winter, the Long Water freezes thick and clean, and by old custom the court takes to it. There are skaters in bright wool, and braziers ranged along the bank throwing orange light onto the gray ice, and tables of hot spiced wine and roasted chestnuts, and the children of the household are let loose to slide and tumble and shriek in a way they are permitted on no other day of the year. Queen Saralind loved that day. I had seen it in her for 19 winters. She is a woman who carries the weight of a kingdom with a straight back and a level voice, and there are not many days when you see the girl she must once have been still living somewhere behind the crown. The winter reception was one of them. She would come down from the terraces in a long gray coat with fur at the collar, and she would stand at the edge of the ice with her hands clasped, watching her children skate, and her face would soften into something no portrait has ever caught and no portrait ever will. The Prince-Consort, Aldrich, did not skate. He was a tall, spare man with iron in his hair before his time, and a stillness of his own, not the trained stillness of a guardsman, but the deeper stillness of a man who had learned young to weigh his every word, because every word he spoke was heard by people who would carry it far. He stood with the Queen at the bank, and the two of them watched the children, and I have thought since that I never saw him laugh aloud in all my years of service except on that day, when the boy did something foolish on the ice and went down in a heap and came up grinning with his hat over one eye. The boy, I should tell you about the boy because everything turns on him. Prince Joran was 10 years old that winter, and he was, in the way of 10-year-old boys, made entirely of motion. Where his sister Malin, who was 8, was careful and watchful and had a way of looking at a thing twice before she touched it, Joran ran at the world headlong. He could not stand still to save his life, and I say that now with a bitter edge because on that morning standing still was precisely the thing that might have saved it. He was a good boy. I want that understood. He was not spoiled, though he might easily have been. The Queen and the Prince-Consort had seen to that. He was simply 10, and full of life, and certain in the way only a child can be certain that nothing in the world could ever truly harm him. My post that morning was the eastern terrace stair, the broad stone steps that come down from the palace's eastern face to the gardens, and the long water below. It is a good post and an old one. From the top of the stair you can see the whole sweep of the east gardens, the terraces in their tiers, the bank of the lake, and the gray expanse of the ice. I had stood it many times. I stood it that morning in the full ceremonial. The red tunic, the black bearskin, the white gloves, the medals I had earned across 19 years. They were modest medals, the long service and the good conduct, and one for a thing I did in the line regiments that I do not speak of, and the rifle at the order, but to the stone, my hand flat upon it. The reception had been under way for the better part of an hour. The braziers were lit. The skaters were out. I could hear faintly the scrape of blades on ice and the high bright sound of children's voices, and under it, the steady murmur of the court. I stood at the head of the stair and let it all wash past me, eyes forward, the way I had stood 10,000 mornings before. And then, beneath the ordinary sounds, I heard a wrongness. I cannot tell you precisely what it was. A guardsman who has stood long enough develops an ear for the texture of a crowd, for the difference between the noise of people enjoying themselves and the noise of people just beginning to be afraid. It is a thing below words. The bright voices changed pitch. The murmur of the court caught the way a breath catches. And under it, far out on the ice, there came a sound I had never heard before and have never forgotten since. The long, groaning crack of frozen water deciding it has held enough. I moved my eyes. Only my eyes, that much I will confess, that for the space of one breath the training held and I moved nothing but my eyes. And I saw, far out toward the center of the long water, well beyond the safe margin near the bank, a small figure in a dark blue coat where no small figure had any business being. He had wandered out. Of course he had wandered out. He could not stand still. He had seen something out there in the gray distance, a bird perhaps, or the simple dare of the empty ice, and he had gone after it the way he went after everything headlong, and no one had marked him go until the ice began to speak. It was Joran. I knew it in the way you know your own name. The set of him, the dark blue of the winter coat, the careless angle of his shoulders even now, even with the ice groaning under him, I knew it was the prince. And in the same instant I knew something else, something cold and exact that cut through 19 years of training like a blade through wool. That he was too far out for anyone at the bank to reach him in time, that the ice beneath him was failing, and that between the boy and the safe ground there was a stretch of gray that was already, here and there, gone dark with water welling up through the cracks. I have been asked since what went through my mind. The honest answer is, nothing. There was no deliberation. There was no weighing of duty against duty, no calculation of what the regulations permitted, no thought of my post or my orders or the 19 unbroken years. There was the boy and the failing ice and a distance, an account of seconds that was already running out, and there was my body, which was moving before my mind had given it any leave at all. The rifle, I remember setting it down. Even then, even running, some part of me would not simply drop it. I laid it against the stone balustrade with a care that seems absurd to me now. The bearskin I let fall. The white gloves I tore off with my teeth as I took the stairs 3 at a time, because gloves are no use on wet ice, and I knew already, in that animal part of a man that knows such things, that I was going to need my hands. I went down the eastern terrace stair faster than any man in ceremonial has ever gone down it, and I went across the bank scattering courtiers and chestnut sellers, and a brazier that I sent spilling its coals hissing onto the frozen ground. And I heard, distantly, voices begin to rise into something like screaming, and I heard a woman's voice, the Queen's voice. Though I did not know it then, I knew only that it was a mother's voice call out a single name into the gray morning. And I went out onto the ice. You do not run on failing ice, that much I knew. I had no special knowledge of ice. I was a soldier, not a riverman, but a man who has stood 19 winters at a northern palace learns a few things about the cold water by simple proximity to it, and one of them is that weight kills. A man's weight, concentrated under his 2 feet, drives down through ice that might have held him had he spread himself. So I did not run. The hardest thing I have ever done with my body was to make it stop running, 20 feet out, where the surface had begun to give a sick, springing flex under my boots, and to go down onto my belly, and to spread my arms and legs wide across the gray, and to begin to haul myself out toward the boy by my elbows and the toes of my boots, flat to the ice, distributing the weight of me across as much of the failing surface as I could. It was the longest distance I have ever traveled. It cannot have been more than 40 feet. It felt like 40 miles. Ahead of me, Joran had stopped. He had felt the ice fail under him, and to his great credit, the boy had had the sense to go still. The one time in his life, I have thought since, that being still had been the right of it. He was crouched low, small hands flat on the gray, his white face turned back toward the bank, and he was not screaming. That is the thing I remember most clearly. He was not screaming. He was looking back toward his mother and his father on the bank with an expression I will never forget, an expression that was not yet terror but was the very edge of it, the look of a child who has understood, perhaps for the first time in his short life, that the world can in fact harm him after all. "Don't move," I said. I do not know if he heard me at first. My voice did not sound like my own. "Don't move, Your Highness. Stay just exactly as you are. I am coming to you. Look at me. Look at my face and don't look at anything else." He looked at me. And in his eyes, even across that gray distance, I saw something that steadied my own hammering heart. He knew me. Not by name, perhaps. I was one of dozens of red tunics he saw every day of his life. But he knew the uniform, and the uniform meant the guard, and the guard meant the one thing every child of that household had been taught from the cradle, which is that the man in the red tunic is the man who keeps you safe. He fixed his eyes on me, and he held himself still, trusting, the way you trust the thing you have always been told to trust, and I have wondered since whether it was that, whether it was 19 years of the guard standing immovable at every door of his short life, teaching him without a word that here was safety, that kept the boy from bolting in panic and going through. I crawled. I will not pretend it was anything grander than that. I crawled across the failing ice on my belly like a man crawling under fire, and the surface flexed and groaned and once, off to my left, gave way entirely with a sound like a snapped bone, and a black mouth of water opened where my hand had been a heartbeat before, and I felt the cold of it splash my face, and I kept on. The cold was a living thing. It came up through the ice into my chest and my arms and the bones of my legs, and it was the kind of cold that does not hurt at first, which is the dangerous kind, the kind that is already stealing your strength before you have understood that it is your enemy. "Almost there," I said. I do not think I believed it. "Almost there, don't reach for me. Whatever you do, don't reach. Let me come to you." For a child to be still while a man crawls toward him across breaking ice, for a 10-year-old boy made of motion, to fight down every screaming instinct that says run, that says reach, that says scramble for the man who has come to save you, that is a kind of courage I am not sure I could have managed at his age. Perhaps not at mine. He held. He held while I closed the last 10 feet and the last 5 and the last 2, and then I was beside him, and I got one arm across his back, and I felt how he was shaking, the deep helpless shudder of a small body that has been still too long against the cold. And I said low into the side of his head, "I have you. I have you now. You are not going to fall. Do you hear me, Joran? I have you and I am not going to let go. I do not know if I should have used his name without his title. In that moment I would have used anything. I would have called him son. The line between us, the great careful line that the whole architecture of the court exists to maintain, the line that says a guardsman does not touch the royal person, does not speak to him unbidden, does not so much as meet his eye, that line did not exist out there on the gray ice. There was a man and a child in the cold water waiting under both of them, and nothing else in the world. Getting him back was harder than getting out. A man can spread his own weight. A man cannot easily spread the weight of two. I turned us slowly by inches until we faced the bank, and I got the boy half across my back. His arms locked around my neck the way I told him to lock them. His face pressed between my shoulder blades, and I began the long haul back the way I had come, dragging the both of us by my elbows and my toes, and now the ice that had barely held me alone protested under the doubled load with every foot we gained. I felt it begin to go beneath us perhaps 15 feet from the bank. There is a particular sensation, which I hope you never feel, of solid ground turning to something else under your body, a softening, a sag, the surface beginning to dish downward like the skin of a drum pressed by a thumb. I felt it, and I knew we had moments and not minutes, and I did the only thing left to do. I gathered everything that was left in my cold emptied arms, and I drove us forward in a single lunging heave toward the dark line of the bank. And behind us, where we had been, the ice let go all at once with a roar and a heave of black water, and my hands found the frozen mud of the margin, the blessed unmoving earth, and other hands were there. Many hands, gardeners' hands and footmen's hands, and one pair of long fine hands that I did not at first understand the meaning of, and they had us. They had the both of us, and they hauled us up out of the dying ice and onto the solid ground of Eldermoor, and it was done. I remember lying on the frozen mud of the bank with the world spinning and the breath sawing in and out of my chest and the boy being lifted off my back. And I remember a great noise that I slowly understood was people, the whole court, crying out, and I remember thinking, with the strange flat clarity that comes after a thing like that, a single absurd thought: I have left my post. Then a woman was on her knees in the mud beside her son, the gray fur-collared coat dragging in the muck, and she heedless of it, gathering the shaking boy against her with a sound I have never heard a queen make before or since. And a tall spare man was kneeling beside them with his hand pressed flat to the boy's back as if to assure himself by touch that the child was real and breathing. And I understood that the long fine hands that had helped to haul me from the ice had been the Prince-Consort's own. He looked at me then, Aldrich. Across the small space of frozen ground, over the head of his weeping wife and his living son, the Prince-Consort of Eldermoor looked at me where I lay gasping in the mud, and his face. I have tried many times to describe his face in that moment, and I have never found the words for it. It was not the face of a man thanking a servant. It was the face of a man looking at something he did not yet have a name for. He did not speak. He only looked, and held my eyes for a long moment, and gave one slow nod, the smallest motion of his head, and somehow that nod said more than any speech could have. Then he turned back to his son, and the footmen were lifting me, and the world closed over the moment like water over a stone. I thought in my simplicity that the story ended there. A boy saved, a guardsman thanked, the realm carrying on. I was a soldier. I understood saving and being thanked. What I did not understand, what 19 years at my post had not taught me, was that there are men at a court for whom a thing like that morning on the ice is not a rescue at all. It is an opportunity, and in the days that followed I learned the hard way that the longest distance a man can be made to travel is not 40 feet of breaking ice. It is the distance between doing a right thing and being allowed to have done it. They took me to the guardroom and stripped the soaked tunic off me and wrapped me in blankets and put something hot and strong in my hands. And the men of my company stood around me not knowing what to say, because nothing in the long traditions of the guard tells a man what to say to a brother who has just broken the one rule they all live by. in order to keep the one promise underneath all the rules. Sergeant Halloran, who had served even longer than I and whose face was as weathered as the forecourt stone, put one heavy hand on my shoulder and left it there, and that was all, and it was enough. It was perhaps an hour later, when I had stopped shaking and the feeling had come back into my hands, that the first of it began. A junior officer of the household, a smooth young man named Cawley who served as undersecretary to the Lord Chamberlain, came into the guardroom with a leather folder under his arm and a pleasant, regretful expression on his face, and asked me, very courteously, whether I understood that I had abandoned a posted guard during a state occasion, and whether I would be so good as to give him a full account of my actions for the record. For the record, I remember the words. I sat there wrapped in a blanket, an hour out of the freezing water, having dragged the heir's brother, having dragged a living, breathing 10-year-old boy back from the edge of the cold dark, and a smooth young man with a leather folder asked me to account for myself for the record, as though I had been found asleep at my post or drunk on duty, and I understood, slowly, the way the cold had come up through the ice into my chest. That the simple thing I thought I had done was about to become very complicated indeed. To understand what came next, you must understand the Lord Chamberlain. The office of Lord Chamberlain of the household is one of the oldest at Harrowgate, and in a well-ordered reign it is one of the most useful. The Chamberlain is the man who makes the palace work, who orders the precedence at every banquet, who governs the comings and goings of the court, who knows where every key in the building hangs and who is permitted to turn it. He is, by the nature of his office, a man who lives by rules, and a man who has spent his whole life by rules can come to love them the way other men love wealth or power, until the rule itself becomes the thing he serves, and the purpose underneath the rule is forgotten. The Lord Chamberlain in those years was a man named Aldous Pemberton, the Earl of Marsh. He had held the office for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time he had grown into it until the two could not be told apart. He was a tall man, very upright, with silver hair brushed back from a high forehead and a voice that never rose and never needed to. He was not, I want to be fair, a wicked man. I have called him many things in the privacy of my own thoughts in the years since, but I have never quite been able to call him wicked, and that is the truth. He believed, with his whole cold heart, in order, in the great machine of precedence and protocol that he had spent his life tending, and he believed that the machine was the realm, and that anything which damaged the machine damaged the realm, even if the thing that damaged it was a guardsman pulling a drowning boy out of a lake. And there was the rub, you see. Because by the strictest letter of the household regulations, which the Lord Chamberlain knew better than any man alive, I had committed not one offense that morning but a string of them. I had abandoned a posted guard during a state occasion, a hanging matter in the old days. I had laid down a service rifle unsecured in a public place. I had laid hands upon the royal person without leave. I had addressed a member of the royal family without being addressed first, and had used the prince's given name without his title before the assembled court. Any one of these in the great book of the household was a serious thing. Together, they made a case. I did not understand, that first afternoon in the guardroom, that a case was being made. I thought young Cawley's questions were a formality, the kind of paperwork that follows any unusual event, the way a report follows the firing of a weapon. I answered them honestly and fully. I told him exactly what I had done and exactly why, and I signed my name to it, and I thought no more about it, because I was tired to the marrow and I wanted nothing in the world but to sleep. It was Sergeant Halloran who set me right. He came to my quarters that evening after lights and sat down heavily on the end of my cot, and was silent for a while in the way of old soldiers, and then he said, "Vance, you want to be careful what you sign today." "I signed the truth," I said. That's what I'm afraid of." He turned his cap in his hands. "The truth is that you left your post. Doesn't matter why. There's men in this palace who will read that report and they won't see a boy pulled out of the water. They'll see a guardsman who left his post and put his hands on the prince. And there's one man in particular who'll see it that way, because seeing it that way is his whole reason for being. The boy would have drowned, I said. I could hear how my own voice had gone tight. The boy would have drowned, Halloran agreed. Everyone with eyes in their head knows it. The queen knows it. The Prince-Consort knows it. He was in the mud beside you, man. He pulled you out himself. But knowing a thing and being allowed to say it out loud at a court are two different animals, and you've just learned that the hard way. He stood and put his cap back on and looked down at me. Marsh has called an inquiry. Quietly. He's framing it as a review of the security failure that let a child of the household wander onto unsafe ice in the first place, which is a fair thing to review, mind you, that part's no lie. But the review's going to find that the failure was yours, that you should have been watching from your post and prevented it instead of charging across the ice like a man with a heart. And the saving of the boy is going to get folded up small and tucked away, so that what's left on the page is a guardsman who failed his duty and broke every rule in the book. I lay awake a long time after he had gone. I want to tell you that I was angry. The truth is that, in the first days, I was not. I was bewildered. I had spent 19 years inside a system that I believed, with the simple faith of a soldier, to be fundamentally just, to reward duty and punish its absence, to know the difference between a good man and a bad one. And I could not make that belief fit the thing that was happening to me. I had saved the boy. Everyone agreed I had saved the boy. And yet here was the great machine of the household turning slowly toward me with the unhurried certainty of a mill wheel, and I could not understand by what arithmetic the saving counted for nothing. It is a particular kind of injury, to be punished for a thing you would do again without a moment's hesitation. It does not bleed. There is no wound to dress. But it gets into a man, that injury, and it works at the foundations of him. And I felt it working at mine through the long gray days of the frost month, while the inquiry gathered itself like a slow storm. The second blow, when it came, was worse than the first, because the first had only tried to make my deed into nothing, and the second tried to make it into someone else's. There was at court in those years a gentleman by the name of Sir Reginald Calloway. He was a man of middle years and considerable charm and very little substance, a courtier in the purest sense, that is, a man whose entire occupation was the court itself, the being seen and the being known, the standing near the right people at the right moments. He held some small office about the household, the keeper of the East Gardens or some such, a sinecure that meant little, and he had a nephew, a young man named Hugo, who served as an equerry and who had been present on the bank that morning of the 8th. Now young Hugo had in fact done a thing on the bank that morning. When I came up out of the ice with the boy, it was Hugo Calloway, among others, who had waded a few feet into the freezing margin to help haul us out, he and the gardeners and the footmen and the Prince-Consort himself. It was a decent thing to do, and I have never said otherwise. But it was not the saving of the boy. The saving of the boy happened 40 feet out on the breaking ice, where only one man went, and that man was me. I learned what Sir Reginald was about when one of the younger guardsmen, a good lad named Tobias Finch, came to me white-faced one morning and said, "Vance, you need to hear what's being said in the household hall." And I went and I stood at the back of the servants' passage and I listened, and what I heard was Sir Reginald Calloway, in his fine carrying voice, telling a knot of attentive courtiers the story of how his brave nephew Hugo had plunged into the freezing water to save the life of Prince Joran, and how the boy owed his life to the Calloway courage, and how he should not be surprised if some recognition were not in order from a grateful crown. I stood in the passage, and I felt something I had not felt in 19 years of standing my post through every provocation a man can devise. I felt the heat come up the back of my neck. I felt my hands close. I had taken cigarettes against my glove and insults for an hour and a woman's lit cigarette against my skin, and I had not moved. And here was a man I had never harmed, who had been a frightened spectator on the bank, calmly and pleasantly stealing the one true thing I had ever done. And I had to grip the cold stone of the passage wall and breathe until the heat went down, because a guardsman does not brawl in the household hall, and because I knew, with a sick certainty, that if I went out there and called him a liar, I would only be giving the Lord Chamberlain's inquiry exactly what it wanted. A guardsman who could not govern himself. So I said nothing. I went back to the guard room and I said nothing, and that was the hardest stillness I have ever kept, harder than any I kept at any post, because at my post the stillness protected the realm, and here the stillness only protected my enemies. There was a comfort in those gray days, and it came from a quarter I had not expected. I have spoken of the men of my company, of Halloran with his hand on my shoulder and young Finch white-faced in the passage. There was also Captain Brennan, who commanded the Eastern Watch, under whom I had served for 11 years, a square, hard man not given to sentiment, who came to me on the third day and said, without preamble, "I have read your report and I have read the households, and I will tell you to your face that the households is a lie wrapped around 3 true facts, which is the most dangerous kind of lie there is. I cannot stop the inquiry. The Lord Chamberlain outranks me by half the realm. But I can tell you that the guard stands behind you, and I can tell you that I will say so under oath in any room they care to put me in, and they cannot make me say otherwise." He had said it the way a man reads a casualty list, flat and without flourish, and it had meant more to me than any speech. But the comfort I did not expect came from the boy. 3 days after the ice, a footman came to the guardroom in the evening with a folded paper, sealed with a small blob of plain wax, and gave it to me without a word and went away again. I opened it by the light of the guardroom lamp, with Halloran watching me curiously across the table, and inside, in the round, careful hand of a child who has been made to practice his letters, was this: "Dear Guardsman, I am sorry I went out on the ice. It was a foolish thing and I knew better. Thank you for coming to get me. I was very frightened and you were not, and that helped me to be brave. I asked Mother your name and she told me. I will not forget it. Joran." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it very carefully along its creases and I put it inside my tunic against my chest, where I had carried things before in another life that I do not speak of, and I have it still. It is the most precious thing I own. There are men who have been given lands and titles by grateful crowns. I would not trade that folded paper for any of them. He was wrong about one thing, the boy. I was not unfrightened. I was more frightened than I have ever been in my life. But I had learned, across 19 years, how to wear a calm face over a frightened heart, and the great use of that calm, the whole reason a man trains himself to it, is that it can be lent, in a desperate moment, to a frightened child, so that he can borrow your steadiness until he finds his own. That is what the stillness is for. I had never understood it so clearly before. It is not for the man who wears it. It is for the people who need to believe that someone somewhere is not afraid. I did not know, when I read that letter, that the boy had also asked his mother something else, and that the something else had begun, very quietly, to move the great machine of the court, in a direction the Lord Chamberlain had not foreseen. The inquiry opened formally on the 14th of the frost month, 6 days after the ice. It was held in the Lesser Council Chamber, a long paneled room on the 2nd floor of the palace's old wing, with a high cold fireplace and a long table of dark wood and tall windows that looked out over the very gardens where the thing had happened. I was made to wait in an antechamber for the better part of an hour, in full ceremonial, standing. They did not offer me a chair, and I would not have taken one if they had, while inside the chamber the household's case was laid out by young Cawley with his leather folder and overseen by the Lord Chamberlain from the head of the table. When at last I was called in, I marched to the open space before the table and came to attention and stood, eyes forward, as I had stood 10,000 mornings, and I let them look at me. There were perhaps a dozen men at the table, the Lord Chamberlain at the head, silver and upright and cold, Cawley at his right hand with his papers. A scattering of household officers, a clerk to take the record and set a little apart, as though he were a spectator and not a judge. A man I did not at first recognize, a quiet, plainly dressed gentleman of middle years who sat with his hands folded and watched everything and said nothing. I learned later that he was Master Corin, the Queen's own private secretary, and that he was there as her eyes, and that his silent presence in that room was the first move in a game the Lord Chamberlain did not yet know he was playing. "Guardsman Vance," the Lord Chamberlain began, in his level, carrying voice, "you understand the purpose of this review. A child of the royal household came to mortal peril on unsafe ice during a state occasion that it was, in part, your duty to secure. This board is charged with establishing how that failure of security came about, and with recommending such corrections and such consequences as the protection of the household requires. Do you understand?" "I understand the words, my lord," I said. Something flickered behind his eyes at that. "You understand the words, but not the substance." "I understand that a board has been called to find a failure, my lord. I am trying to understand whose." A small stir went round the table. The Lord Chamberlain did not stir. "The failure, guardsman, is not in question. A boy of 10 walked unobserved across 40 feet of an iced lake until it broke beneath him. That is, on its face, a catastrophic lapse in the security of the East Gardens. The only questions before this board are how it occurred and who bears responsibility for it. You are the guardsman posted to the eastern terrace stair, with a clear view of the entire garden and the long water." "Is that correct?" "It is, my lord. From that post you could see the children at their play upon the ice." "I could see the bank, my lord, and the safe margin where the household skated. I could not have told one small figure from another at the center of the long water, even had I been looking at the center of the long water, which I was not, because there was no one upon it. The prince did not walk out across 40 feet of ice in plain view, my lord. He went out in an instant, when an instant's worth of attention was elsewhere, the way a child of 10 does everything. By the time the ice spoke, he was already out." "And yet," said the Lord Chamberlain, "you reached him, so the distance was not in the end uncrossable. Had you been more vigilant, you might have called him back before he ever went out and spared us all this morning's drama. Instead you were, by your own account, standing at the order with your eyes forward, watching nothing in particular until the crisis was already upon us. Is that not a fair summary of your own report? It was a clever thing, and I saw the cleverness of it even through my anger. He had taken the very stillness that is the whole virtue of a king's guard, the eyes forward, the not fidgeting, the watching of the whole and not the part, and he had turned it into the thing that had let the boy slip out unobserved. He had made my discipline into my dereliction." "My lord," I said, and I kept my voice level because I knew that level was the only weapon I had in that room. I stood my post as the regulations of the guard require me to stand it. Eyes forward, watching the whole. That is the post. If the post is wrong, if a guardsman ought to be turning his head this way and that to track every child in a garden full of 300 people, then it is the regulation that has failed, and not the man who kept it. But I do not believe the regulation has failed. I believe a boy of 10 did a thing that boys of 10 do, very fast, and that no posted guard on that stair could have prevented it. And I believe that when it happened, the post I had kept for 19 years was the very thing that let me see it in time and reach him before the water took him. You ask why I did not call him back. My lord, I did not see him go. No one saw him go. But I saw him out there when the ice began to fail, and I reached him, and he is alive. I am sorry that I cannot give this board the failure it is looking for. The only failure I can find in that morning is that the cold water did not get to keep what it had taken, and I am not sorry for that one." The room was very quiet when I had finished. The clerk's pen had stopped. The quiet man set apart from the table, Master Corin, though I did not know him yet, had turned his head and was looking at me with a thoughtful expression. And the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Marsh, looked at me down the length of that long dark table with no anger at all in his cold gray eyes, only a kind of patient regret, the way a man looks at a tool that has bent under load, and he said very quietly, "That was an eloquent speech, guardsman. I will note for the record that you do not lack for spirit. But spirit is not the question before us. Order is the question. A household that permits its guardsmen to abandon their posts whenever their hearts move them is a household that cannot be kept safe, however many boys are pulled out of however many lakes. You saved a child. I do not dispute it, and I have never disputed it. But you also taught every guardsman in this palace that the post may be left when a man feels strongly enough, and that lesson, Guardsman Vance, will cost this household far more lives than it saved, on some morning yet to come, when a man leaves his post for a reason that turns out to be wrong. That is what I am charged to prevent. That is what this is about. It was never about you. And the terrible thing, the thing I lay awake over for many nights afterward, is that he was not entirely wrong. That is what I had not understood at the start, and what I came to understand in that cold paneled room, that the Lord Chamberlain was making an argument I could not simply call evil and dismiss. A guard who leaves his post is, in the cold arithmetic of a household's safety, a danger. The whole strength of a king's guard is that he does not move, that he is a fixed point, a thing the realm can build itself around, precisely because he will not abandon it for any cause however good. The day every guardsman decides for himself which causes are good enough to leave his post for is the day the post means nothing. The Lord Chamberlain knew that and lived by it, and he was asking the realm to weigh it against one boy's life, and he was honest enough, I will give him this, to say out loud the brutal thing that most men in his place would have only thought, that he would rather lose the boy than lose the rule, because the rule, over years, saves more boys than any single guardsman's heart ever could. I have turned that over 1,000 times, and I have come to believe that he was right about the rule and wrong about the man, and that the whole tragedy of a man like the Earl of Marsh is that he could not tell the difference, that he could not see that the rule is a servant and not a master, a thing made to protect the people underneath it, and that on the rare and terrible morning when the rule and the people it serves come apart, a good man chooses the people and bears the cost of the broken rule. And a great household finds a way to honor him for it rather than to break him in turn. The rule exists for the boy. It does not exist for itself. The Lord Chamberlain had served the rule so long that he had forgotten what it was for, and that forgetting was his real failure, far greater than any failure of mine on the stair. But I could not say that in that room to that man and have it count for anything, so I said the only thing I could say. "My lord," I said, "I will not stand here and tell you that a guardsman should leave his post. You are right that he should not. I have kept mine for 19 years through every cause a man could invent to make me leave it, and I never left it once, because you are right that the realm needs us to be the thing that does not move. But there is one cause, only one, that a man cannot weigh against his post, because it cannot be weighed at all, and that is the life of a child going under the ice 40 feet from his mother. If you tell me that I should have stood at my post and watched the prince drown to keep faith with the regulation, then I tell you, with all respect to your office, that I do not want the regulation, and I do not want the post, and you may have my tunic this hour. Because a guard that would do that is not guarding anything worth the name." I had said too much. I knew it as the words left me. I had given him exactly the defiance the inquiry needed, a guardsman declaring, before witnesses and the record, that he placed his own judgment above his orders. I saw young Cawley's pen move quickly across his paper. I saw the small, satisfied stillness settle over the Lord Chamberlain's face, the look of a man whose case has just been completed for him by the accused's own mouth. And then the quiet man set apart from the table spoke for the first time. "If the board will permit," said Master Corin in a mild, unhurried voice, "I have a question for the guardsmen." The Lord Chamberlain inclined his head, a touch too quickly. He did not know yet what was coming, but he knew that the Queen's private secretary did not ask questions idly, and a thread of caution had entered his manner. "Guardsman Vance," said Master Joran, folding his hands upon the table, "you have told this board that you could not weigh the prince's life against your post. I want to ask you a different question. When you went out onto the ice, when you laid down your rifle and your bearskin and went down on your belly and crawled toward the boy, did you, at any moment, believe that you would also come back?" The room went still in a different way than before. I thought about the question honestly because it deserved an honest answer, and because I had not, until that moment, asked it of myself. "No, sir," I said at last. "I did not think I would come back. I thought the ice would not hold the both of us. I thought when I started out that I was likely going into the water with him, and that the most I could hope for was to push him toward the bank as I went down. I did not think about coming back." There was not time to think about it, and if there had been, I do not believe it would have changed anything. Master Joran nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he already knew. "So this board is asked to find," he said, and now his mild voice had a quiet edge to it that had not been there before, "that a man who crawled out onto breaking ice, fully expecting to die, in order to save a 10-year-old boy whom he was under no specific order to save, and could easily have left to the gardeners and the footmen who were far closer to the safe margin than he was. This board is asked to find that this man committed a grave breach of discipline for which he should be punished. I want that finding written very plainly in the record, my lord, with that question and that answer beside it, so that everyone who reads it hereafter understands exactly what it is that this household chose to do." He turned to the clerk. "Have you got it? The question and the answer in full. Read it back." The clerk, looking flustered, read it back. The room listened, and I watched the Lord Chamberlain's face, and I saw, for the first time, the smallest crack run through the cold certainty of it. Not because he had been moved. I do not think he was a man who was easily moved, but because he had understood in that moment that the game had changed. That the report he had meant to bury me in was now going to be read by someone he could not control, and that it would say, in his own clerk's hand, that the household had punished a man for choosing to die for the prince. He had built his case to be read by the like-minded. He had not built it to be read by the Queen. "Master Joran," the Lord Chamberlain said, and his voice was as level as ever, but there was something new underneath it now. "This board is a household matter. With great respect to the office you hold, I am not certain that—" "I am here at Her Majesty's request," Master Joran said, very gently, "and let the silence after it do the rest." The Lord Chamberlain inclined his head. He was too old and too clever to fight a battle on ground that had just shifted under him. "Of course," he said, "Her Majesty's interest in the welfare of her household is, as ever, an honor to us all. The board will, naturally, ensure that the record is complete and accurate in every particular." He gathered the edges of his composure around him like a cloak. "We will adjourn and reconvene when we have taken further testimony. Guardsman Vance, you are dismissed. You will return to light duties within the barracks, and you will not, for the present, stand any post connected to the royal person. Is that understood?" "It is, my lord," I said. I marched out of that room not knowing whether I had been saved or doomed, and the truth, as I would learn, was that I had been neither, and that the real reckoning was still some way off, and that there was worse to come before it got better. The worst came in two parts, and the first part wore the smiling face of Sir Reginald Calloway. I had thought, after the inquiry, that Master Joran's intervention would settle the matter of who had saved the prince, that with the Queen's eye now on the record, the truth of the ice would simply assert itself, and the Calloway story would wither for want of air. I underestimated Sir Reginald, and I underestimated the appetite of a court for a flattering tale. The truth of the ice was a hard, plain thing, a guardsman crawling on his belly through the cold, expecting to die. The Calloway story was a pretty thing, a young gentleman of good family plunging gallantly into the water to save his prince, and a court would always rather repeat a pretty thing than a hard one. And Sir Reginald had grown bolder, not more cautious, in the days since the inquiry. He had heard, as everyone hears everything at a court, that the guardsman who pulled the boy out was now under a cloud, confined to barracks, barred from the royal person, the subject of a household review. And a man under a cloud is a man whose story can be safely taken from him, because who will believe the word of a guardsman in disgrace against the word of a gentleman in favor? So Sir Reginald began to tell his nephew's tale, not in corners and household halls, but openly, at the Queen's own table, in the long galleries where the court walked of an afternoon, polishing it with each telling until young Hugo had not merely waded into the margin but had swum out through the breaking ice, until it was Hugo's arm and not mine that the boy had clung to, until the guardsman, when the guardsman was mentioned at all, appeared in the tale only as a clumsy fellow who had blundered out late and had to be helped from the water himself by the gallant Hugo. I heard these tellings reported back to me by Finch and the others, who heard them everywhere, and each one was a small cold stone laid on my chest. I have stood unmoved while a man cursed me for an hour. I could not stand unmoved under this. To be punished for the deed was one thing. To have the deed itself taken from me and handed, polished and gleaming, to a man who had stood frightened on the bank, that was a theft of a kind I had no defense against, because the only defense would have been to stand up in the long galleries and call Sir Reginald a liar, and a guardsman who does that is finished, cloud or no cloud. It was Captain Brennan who found the thread that began to unravel it, and he found it not by cleverness, but by the plain soldier's habit of checking a thing before he repeated it. Calloway's gone too far, Brennan told me in the guardroom on a gray afternoon near the month's end. He's put it about that his nephew was soaked to the skin that morning, swam out through the ice, near drowned himself, the whole heroic business, and it's a fine story except for one thing. He laid a sheet of paper on the table between us. The household's own laundry returns. Every garment that came in soaked from the East Gardens that morning is listed here, because the under-laundress is a careful woman and she logged the lot. Yours are here: tunic, breeches, the works soaked through, 3 gardeners, 2 footmen, the prince's own coat, and precisely nothing belonging to young Hugo Calloway, because young Hugo Calloway got his boots wet to the ankle wading into the margin and not one stitch above that, which is exactly what a man's clothes look like when he has stood on the bank and helped to haul, and exactly not what they look like when he has swum through breaking ice. Brennan tapped the paper. A man can lie with his mouth all he likes. It's the harder to lie with the laundry. I looked at the sheet, and at the line where my own ruined uniform was logged, soaked through and through, and at the blank where Hugo Calloway's swim should have been and was not, and I felt the first faint loosening of the cold stone on my chest. "It won't clear me of the inquiry," I said. "No," Brennan agreed, "different matter that. But it'll clear the lie-about who went into the water, and once the court sees one of Calloway's claims is false they'll start to wonder about the rest, and the truth of the ice has a way of surfacing once people start to doubt the pretty version. Leave it with me. I know a man in the household who hates Sir Reginald worse than I do, and a careful word in the right ear does more than a shouted word in the wrong one." I did not ask what Brennan meant to do, and he did not tell me, and I have always thought it better that I did not know the particulars. I know only that within the week the story in the long galleries had changed, that the laundry returns had found their way, by some quiet channel, to people who mattered, that a question had been asked, pleasantly, at the Queen's table, about precisely how wet young Hugo had got, that Sir Reginald, pressed for the detail, had blustered and contradicted himself, and that a court which had been so eager to repeat the pretty tale was now, with the same fickle appetite, just as eager to repeat the delicious news that the pretty tale had been a fabrication. Sir Reginald Calloway, who had reached for an honor that was not his, found himself instead the subject of the court's laughter, which is the one thing a courtier cannot survive, and he withdrew from Harrowgate before the season was out and did not return. His nephew Hugo, I should say, behaved better than his uncle in the end. The young man came to me, red-faced and miserable, and said that he had never claimed any of it, that it had all been his uncle's doing and that he was ashamed, and I believed him. And I told him that he had done a decent thing wading into the cold margin to help haul us out, and that he should be proud of the true thing and let the false thing go. We parted on good terms. I have always thought he was a better man than his uncle had tried to make him. So the theft of my deed was undone. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt only the second worst thing settling over me, which was this: that with the Calloway lie exposed, the court now agreed, openly and universally, that it was Guardsman Vance who had saved the prince, and that the household inquiry was still, all the same, grinding toward a finding that Guardsman Vance had committed a grave breach of discipline. The two facts now stood side by side in the open, plain for everyone to see, and the court found nothing strange in their standing together. Yes, he saved the boy. Yes, he must be punished for how he saved him. The pretty version had been about who. The hard version had never been about who. It had always been about the rule, and the rule did not care who had saved the boy. The rule cared only that a post had been left. This is the false dawn, if you are the kind to mark such things. For a few bright days I thought the exposure of Calloway had turned the whole matter, that the truth coming out about who had saved the prince would surely sweep away the inquiry along with the lie. It did not. The inquiry ground on, untouched, because it had never depended on the lie. The truth had set right a smaller wrong and left the larger one exactly where it stood. And I understood, in those days, the particular cruelty of a thing being half fixed. It gives you just enough hope to make the rest of the fall hurt worse. In the worst of those days, confined to the barracks and barred from any post that mattered, set to the dull rounds of light duty that the household gives a man it has not yet decided what to do with, I came as near as I have ever come to leaving the guard of my own accord. It was not the punishment that brought me to it. A soldier can bear punishment. Punishment is a thing the world does to you, and a man can stand inside himself while the world does its worst and keep his own counsel about whether the world is right. What brought me near to breaking was something quieter and more corrosive. The slow understanding that the thing I had given my whole adult life to, the guard, the post, the great patient discipline of standing immovable in the service of the realm, might not in the end be what I had believed it to be. I had believed that the discipline served something good. I had believed that the rule and the right were, in the main, the same thing, and that on the rare days they parted, the household would know the difference and choose the right. I had believed that a man who did the hard good thing would, in the long reckoning, be honored for it. And here was the long reckoning, grinding toward a finding that I had failed in my duty, and the household showing no sign at all of knowing the difference between the rule and the right, and I did not know any longer what it was I had stood 19 years for. That is the real wound of a thing like this, not the loss of rank or post or reputation, the loss of the belief that holds a disciplined man together, the belief that the discipline is for something. Take that from a guardsman and you have taken more than his tunic. You have taken the floor he stands on. I sat with it through the long cold nights, and I will not pretend I sat with it nobly. I drafted my resignation 3 times and burned it twice, and very nearly let the third one stand. I lay awake and rehearsed bitter speeches I would never give. I took the folded paper from inside my tunic and read the boys round careful letters by the guardroom lamp. I was very frightened and you were not, and that helped me to be brave, and I asked myself what the use of any of it had been, if this was the end of it. And it was the letter in the end that held me, because every time I read it I came back to the same plain fact, which no inquiry and no finding and no cold-eyed Lord Chamberlain could touch. The boy was alive. Whatever they wrote in their record, whatever they took from me, that fact stood outside their reach. I had crawled out onto the breaking ice expecting to die, and the boy was alive because I had, And that was a true thing that had happened in the world and would go on having happened forever, no matter what the household decided to call it. They could break me. They could not unsave him. And on the night I understood that clearly, that the deed was mine and would remain mine whatever they did, because it lived not in their record, but in the warm breathing fact of a boy who would grow up and have a life, and never know how near he had come to not having one. On that night, I burned the third resignation and did not draft a fourth. I would stay. I would stand whatever they decided to do to me, and I would stand it on my feet in the tunic until they took the tunic off me themselves. Because the post was not, after all, the household's to give meaning to. The post meant what I had always made it mean, every cold morning for 19 years. Here is a man who will not abandon what he is set to guard. I had not abandoned the prince. I had, on the only morning it had ever truly been tested, kept the deepest meaning of my post in the very act of leaving its outward form, and no finding in any paneled room could change that, because it was not theirs to change. I tell you this part because it is the truest part, and because the rest of the story, the part everyone knows, the part with the medal, means nothing at all unless you understand the night I burned the third resignation. What the Prince-Consort did, he did to a man who had already decided, alone in the dark, that he could bear to lose everything except the truth of the thing itself. He did not save me. I had saved myself in the only way that matters on a cold night with a guardroom lamp and a child's letter. What he did was something else, something I had stopped expecting from the world. He saw, and then he made sure that everyone else saw too. There was one more thing I learned in those barracks weeks, and I set it down here because it mattered greatly to what followed. Master Joran came to see me himself, one evening alone, without ceremony, the Queen's own private secretary, sitting on a hard bench in a cold guardroom across from a guardsman under a cloud. He did not stay long. He asked me only to tell him, in my own words and not for any record, exactly what had happened on the ice, from the first crack to the last heave onto the bank. And I told him plainly, the way I have told you. He listened without a word, and when I had finished he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I did not understand until much later. The Prince-Consort, he said, has not slept well since the 8th of the frost month. He is a man who weighs things, the Prince-Consort, and he has been weighing this. He stood and settled his plain coat about him. I will tell you one thing, guardsman, and then I will go, and you will please not repeat it. There are people in this palace who believe the law of the household is the highest law there is. And there are very few who believe there is a higher one, and that the whole purpose of the household law is to serve it, and that when the two come apart the household law must bend. The Prince-Consort is of the second kind. So is Her Majesty. You have, I think, made things very difficult for the first kind, simply by being right in a way they cannot answer. Bear up. The matter is not decided. It only looks decided. And he went out, and left me to make what I could of it. And what I made of it was very little, because I was a guardsman and not a courtier, and I had not yet learned to read the deep currents of a palace the way Master Joran read them. The inquiry reconvened on the 3rd of the snow month, near a month after the ice. I knew, going in, that the finding was likely to go against me. Master Joran's intervention had forced the truth into the record, and the truth had shamed the cruder lies, but the Lord Chamberlain had spent the intervening weeks rebuilding his case on firmer ground, not on whether I had saved the boy, which was now beyond dispute, but on the narrower, harder question of the post itself. That whatever the outcome, a guardsman had left a posted guard during a state occasion, had laid down an unsecured weapon, had laid hands upon the royal person, and that to let this pass without consequence would be to tell every guardsman in the realm that the post might be abandoned at will. It was, as I have said, not a contemptible argument. It was the strongest argument against me precisely because it was partly true, and I had given it teeth myself in the first hearing, when I declared that I would leave my post again without hesitation. A man who promises to break the rule again is a man the rule must, in its own logic, move against. So I marched into the lesser council chamber that third of the snow month expecting to hear myself broken, and I was resolved to take it standing, and I had said my private farewells to the tunic in the dark of the night before. What I did not expect, what no one in that room expected, least of all the Lord Chamberlain, was the sound of the great doors at the far end of the chamber opening in the middle of the proceedings, and the murmur and the scrape of chairs as every man at that long table came up out of his seat as though pulled by a single string, and the door warden's voice, cracking a little with the suddenness of it, announcing a presence that turned the whole inquiry on its head in a single breath. "Her Majesty the Queen," the door warden said, "His Royal Highness the Prince-Consort." I had been standing at attention before the long table, eyes forward, as I had stood at the first hearing. I did not turn, a guardsman does not turn, but I heard them come in, the soft tread of the Queen and the longer stride of the Prince-Consort beside her, and I heard the rustle of the household rising and bowing, and I felt the whole temperature of the room change, the way the air changes before a storm. The Lord Chamberlain at the head of the table had risen with the rest, and when he spoke his level voice had, for the first time in all my dealings with him, the faintest thread of uncertainty in it. "Your Majesty, your Royal Highness, this is an unlooked-for honor. The board is, of course, entirely at your disposal, though I must say, with the deepest respect, that a household disciplinary review is not customarily a matter for the Crown," said Queen Saralind. Her voice was quiet and even, and it carried to every corner of that cold room. I had heard her speak many times across 19 years, at receptions and reviews and on the days of mourning and the days of joy, but I had never heard her speak quite like this, with a stillness underneath the words that was, I realized, a kind of anger held under perfect command. The very discipline I had spent my life learning, in the person of my queen. "You are right, my lord, that the household law is the household's to administer, and I have not come to take it from you. The Crown does not lightly reach into the running of the household. That is precisely why the household runs as well as it does, and I am grateful for it, and for you. But there is a matter here that has passed beyond the household law, and I have come to see it settled, because it touches my son, and because it touches something I will not allow to be decided in a quiet room with the doors shut." "Your Majesty," the Lord Chamberlain began. "Let me finish, Aldous." She used his given name, and gently, and it was the gentleness that silenced him. One does not interrupt a queen who is being gentle. "I have read the record of this inquiry, every word of it. I have read the question Master Corin put to the guardsman, and I have read the guardsman's answer in the clerk's own hand. And I have asked myself, as you have asked yourselves, what is to be done about a man who left his post? It is a fair question. It is perhaps the fairest question this household can ask, because you are right, my lord, you are entirely right, that a guard which leaves its posts at will is no guard at all, and that the safety of my children, of my whole house, rests on the certainty that the man at the door will be at the door. I do not dismiss your concern. I share it. I have lain awake over it. I would not have a household in which guardsmen wander from their posts whenever their feelings move them, and I will tell this guardsman so to his face." And here she did a thing I had not expected. She came round the long table in her plain dark gown, and she stood before me, before the guardsman, in the open space where the accused stands, and she looked up at me, for she was not a tall woman, and she said, "Guardsman Vance, look at me." I looked at her. It is no small thing to be told by your queen to break the eyes forward of a lifetime and look her in the face. I looked at her, and I saw that her eyes were bright, and that the stillness in her was holding back something that was not anger after all, or not only anger. "You left your post," she said. "Do you understand that you must never do such a thing again? That a guardsman who makes a habit of his own judgment is a danger to the very people he loves? Do you understand that the discipline you kept for 19 years is a greater gift to this realm than any single rescue, however brave? And that I need you, I need every man of the guard, to be the thing that does not move, far more often than I will ever need a man to move. I understand it, Your Majesty, I said. My voice was not entirely steady. I have understood it all my life. It is the whole of what I am. I know it is, she said. I have watched you keep it for 19 years. Which is exactly why I am about to tell you the other half of the thing, the half my Lord Chamberlain has left out because it does not fit in his record. She turned then, so that she addressed not me alone but the whole room, the table of household officers, the Lord Chamberlain at its head, the flustered clerk, the silent watchful Master Corin. The discipline is not the highest thing. It is a very high thing among the highest, but it is not the highest, and any household that forgets there is something higher has lost the plot of its own existence. The discipline exists to protect the people of this realm. It is the means. They are the end. And when, on one morning in 100 years, the means and the end come apart, when keeping the post would mean watching the end it exists to protect go under the ice, then a man who keeps faith with the end and breaks faith with the means has not betrayed his duty. He has fulfilled it in the only way left to him, at the cost of everything. And a household that cannot tell that man from a deserter is a household I will not have. Not while I wear this crown. The room was utterly silent. The Lord Chamberlain stood very still at the head of his table, and his face had gone a shade paler, and I understood that the Queen had just said, before the whole board, the very thing I had not been able to say in that room and make it count, and that out of her mouth it counted for everything, because she was the one person at Harrowgate whose judgment of the difference between the rule and the right was, by the oldest law of all, final. The finding of this board, the Queen said, will be that no fault attaches to Guardsman Edmund Vance for his conduct on the 8th of the frost month, that his action in leaving his post was the only honorable course available to a man of conscience in the circumstance, and that the household will, going forward, frame its regulations so that a guardsman who leaves his post to save a life will never again find himself in the dock for it. My Lord Chamberlain, you will see it written so. And you will see, too, that the security of the East Gardens in winter is reviewed, properly and seriously, because in that one thing you have been entirely right, and a child of this house came nearer to death on that ice than I will ever again permit. She paused. Both of those things are true at once. The household must learn to hold two true things at once. It is harder than holding one. It is also the whole of wisdom. It will be done, Your Majesty, the Lord Chamberlain said. And then, and I will give him this, to the end of my days I will give him this. He turned to me, and he inclined his head the smallest fraction, a thing I had never seen him do to any man below the rank of Earl, and he said in his level voice, Guardsman Vance, I have done you a wrong in the manner of this, though I do not believe I did wrong to ask the question. I asked it badly, and I pursued it past the point where the asking served any purpose but my own certainty. The Queen is right. I had forgotten what the rule is for. A man my age ought not to need reminding. I am sorry for it. It cost him a great deal that. I have thought since that it cost him more than it would have cost a lesser man, because he was not a hypocrite. He had truly believed himself in the right, and to admit otherwise was to admit that the whole frame by which he had lived had a flaw in it. He admitted it anyway in open board to a guardsman. There was more honor in the Earl of Marsh than I had given him credit for, and I have tried, ever since, to remember a man by his best moment and not his worst. I thought then that it was over. I thought the Queen's word had settled everything, and that the great wrong had been answered, and that I would walk out of that room cleared and go back to my post and stand it for whatever years were left to me, grateful and quiet. And it would have been enough. I want that understood. The Queen's finding alone would have been more than enough. I would have asked for nothing more in this life. But the Prince-Consort had not yet spoken. He had stood the whole while a little behind the Queen, very still in the deep stillness that was his own, and now he came forward. He came and stood before me, where the Queen had stood, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He only looked at me, The way he had looked at me on the bank that first morning, over the head of his weeping wife and his living son, that look I had never found the words for, the look of a man regarding something he did not yet have a name for. Up close he was grayer than I had remembered, and there were new lines about his eyes, and I remembered what Master Corin had said, that the Prince-Consort had not slept well since the 8th of the frost month, and I believed it. "Guardsman Vance," he said at last. His voice was low and unhurried, and it had a roughness in it that surprised me. "My wife has spoken for the crown and for the realm, and she has spoken well, and what she has said is law. I will not add to it because it does not need adding to. But there is a thing she cannot say because it is not hers to say. It is mine. She is the queen, and she has spoken as the queen must. I am a father, and the father has something to say to you that the queen cannot." He was quiet a moment. The whole room hung on it. "On the 8th of the frost month," he said, "I stood on the bank of the long water, and I watched my son go out onto the ice, and I watched the ice begin to break beneath him, and I was 40 feet too far away to reach him in time, and I knew it. I want you to understand what that is, guardsmen. I have stood at the side of my queen through every kind of difficulty a realm can produce. I have faced things that would have unmanned most men. And nothing in my whole life has ever been like standing on that bank and knowing that my boy was going to die in front of me, and that there was not one thing in all my rank or wealth or power that could save him. A prince is supposed to be able to command anything. I could command nothing. I could not command the ice to hold, or the cold to be less cold, or the distance to be shorter. I stood there, the second man in the kingdom, and I was as helpless as the lowest beggar at the gate, because there are some moments when rank is worth precisely nothing, and the death of your child 40 feet away is one of them." His voice did not break, but it came very near it, and he mastered it in the way I knew, the way a disciplined man masters a thing in front of others and pays for the mastery later, alone. "And then," he said, "a man in a red tunic came down the eastern terrace stair. He set down his rifle, he took off his bearskin, and he went out onto the breaking ice that I could not cross, that no man on that bank dared cross, and he went out on his belly through the cold and the cracking, and he reached my son, and he brought him back. He did the thing I could not do. He did the thing that all my rank could not buy. He gave me back my son's life with his own 2 hands, and he did it expecting by his own word in the record of this very board, expecting to die in the doing of it. He went out there to trade his life for my boy's, and counted it a fair trade, and asked no one's leave. He looked at me, and his gray eyes were wet now, and he did not hide it. 'How does a father thank a man for that?' he said. 'I have asked myself the question for a month. There is no thanks large enough. There is no purse, no land, no title that touches it. A man who has saved your child has given you a gift that cannot be repaid, because there is nothing in the world of equal weight to set against it. I could make you rich. It would be an insult. I could raise you in rank. It would be an insult. Anything I gave you out of my power as a prince would be a transaction, and what you did was not a transaction. So I have thought, and I have come at last to the only thing I have to give that is worth the giving, the only thing I own that means to me what your deed means to me." And then the Prince-Consort of Eldermoor raised his hands to his own breast, to the breast of his own coat, where, by old custom, he wore upon great occasions the highest honor of the Royal House of Harrowgate, the star of the house, the medal that is given to a prince of the blood at his coming of age and worn by no one else in all the realm, the single most personal token of his rank and his line, a thing that had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that. He unpinned it. I heard the small sound of the clasp coming free in the dead silence of that room, and I saw the Queen's hand rise to her own breast as she understood what he meant to do, and I saw the Lord Chamberlain take half a step forward and then stop himself, because there was no rule in all his great book that covered this, and he knew it. And I stood there in the open space before the long table, and I could not move and I could not breathe. "This was my father's," the Prince-Consort said, holding the star in his open palm. the silver and the deep blue enamel of it catching the cold light from the tall windows. And his father's. It is the oldest thing I own and the most personal. It is not a household decoration to be awarded by a board. It is mine, given to me by my own blood, and it has never left this family in 200 years, which is exactly why it is the only thing fit to give to the man who saved my son. Because you did not save him as a guardsman saves a stranger, Vance. You saved him as a father would have saved him. You went out there ready to die for a boy who was not your own, the way only a father is supposed to be ready to die. So you will take the thing a father gives, not the crown's medal, mine. The one that means my blood and my line, and the thing my son is to me. There is nothing else in the world equal to what you did, so I will give you the one thing I have that I love as much. And the Prince-Consort of Eldermoor stepped close to me, and with his own 2 hands, the long fine hands that had helped to haul me out of the ice, he pinned the star of the House of Harrowgate to the breast of my red tunic, above my own modest medals, above the long service and the good conduct and the one I do not speak of, and he pressed the clasp home, and he stepped back, and he looked at it on my chest, and then he looked at my face, and he said, very low so that perhaps only I heard it, "Now we are even, you and I, as even as a father and the man who saved his son can ever be, which is to say, not even at all, not ever, but this is the nearest I can come. Wear it, and when men ask you how a guardsman comes to wear a prince's own star, you tell them the truth. You tell them a father gave it to you, because you gave him back his son. I have stood my post through every provocation a man can devise, and I have never once broken. I broke then. I am not ashamed to set it down. A guardsman of 19 years in full ceremonial before his queen and the whole board of the household, with the star of the house heavy and strange upon his breast. I felt the tears come, and I could not stop them, and I did not try, and I came to attention, the only thing my body knew how to do, and I held the salute, and I could not speak, and the salute said everything I could not say. And the Prince-Consort returned it, a prince of the blood, returning the salute of a guardsman, which is a thing that is not done, which has perhaps never been done in all the long history of the house. And the queen was weeping openly now and not hiding it, and around that long table the hard old household officers, men who had seen everything a court can show, sat with their faces working, and even the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Marsh, stood with his head bowed and his eyes closed as though he were at prayer. There is not much more to tell, and what there is gentle, and I will set it down quickly, because the great moment is past and a story should not linger after its own heart has stopped. The board's finding was written as the Queen had directed in the clerk's careful hand, and it stands in the records of the household to this day, that no fault attached to Guardsman Edmund Vance, that his leaving of his post was the only honorable course, and a new line added at the Queen's insistence that henceforth no guardsman of the Royal House of Harrowgate would ever face discipline for leaving his post to preserve a human life. They call it Vance's provision, the younger men, though I have asked them not to. It is not mine. It belongs to every guardsman who will ever stand a post in a hard winter and have to choose, in a single breath, between the rule and the life. I am only the one it was written for. The security of the East Gardens was reviewed, properly and seriously, as the Queen had also directed, and that mattered as much as the rest of it, though no one made speeches about it. There are now sounding staffs and marked safe margins, and a winter watch set on the long water whenever the court takes to the ice, and a guardsman posted at the bank itself, and not only at the head of the stair. And I have stood that bank post myself on many a winter reception since, close enough now to call a boy back before he ever reaches the failing ice. The Lord Chamberlain was right about that one thing, and I have never let the younger men forget that he was right, because a man who learns to hold 2 true things at once, that the Earl of Marsh wronged me, and that the Earl of Marsh was also right, has learned the thing the Queen said was the whole of wisdom. The Earl of Marsh and I never became friends. We were not made for it. He and I, but we came, in the years that followed, to a kind of respect that was perhaps better than friendship, because it was earned and not easy. He would incline his head to me when our paths crossed in the long galleries, the same small fraction he had given me in the board, no more, and I would salute him, and that was all, and it was enough. And when he died some years later, full of years and still upright to the end, I stood the guard at his lying in of my own asking, the whole long night through, eyes forward, because a man who admits in open board that he had forgotten what the rule was for has earned the watch of the man he wronged. I think he would have understood that. I think, in fact, that of everyone at that court, he was the one who would have understood it best. Sir Reginald Calloway I never saw again. His nephew Hugo, who had behaved better than his uncle, rose in the household service and did well, and we remained on good terms to the end of my service, and when his own first son was born, he asked me to be there at the gates when the boy was first brought into the palace, and I was, and I have never told him why it meant what it meant to me. And the star of the House of Harrowgate, the Prince-Consort's own, his father's and his grandfather's before him, I wear it still, on the great occasions, above my own modest medals, and I have never once been able to do so without the breath catching in my chest. The court grew used to it in time, the strange sight of a guardsman wearing a prince's own star, but the men who come new to Harrowgate always ask, the way young men ask, how such a thing came to be, and I tell them what the Prince-Consort told me to tell them. I tell them the truth. I tell them a father gave it to me because I gave him back his son. And the telling of it has done more, I think, to teach the young guardsmen what the post is truly for than any drill or regulation ever could, because they look at that star on the breast of a plain guardsman, and they understand, without my having to say it, that the stillness they are learning is not an end in itself, that it is held in trust for the moment it must be spent, and that there is a kind of honor in this realm that no rule can confer and no board can withhold, and that it goes, in the end, to the man who keeps faith with the people underneath the rule. As for the boy, the Prince Joran, he is not a boy any longer. He grew, as boys do, into a tall young man, headlong still, but with a steadiness underneath the headlong that I like to think he began to learn on a morning when he held himself still on breaking ice, while a man in a red tunic crawled out to reach him. He has never made a great public thing of it, and I am glad of it, for it is not a thing for speeches. But every year on the 8th of the frost month, a folded paper comes to me, sealed with a small blob of plain wax, and inside, in a hand that has grown from a child's careful round letters into a man's firm strokes but is unmistakably the same hand, are a few words. They are different words each year, but they always end the same way, the way the very first one ended, all those winters ago in the guardroom by the lamp. I will not forget it. Joran. I have kept every one of them. I keep them folded together inside my tunic, against my chest, where a man keeps the things that are worth more than lands or titles or even a prince's own star. For the star is the honor the world can see, and those folded papers are the honor only I will ever hold. And if I had to choose between them, the star would be in the fire before the letters. I am an old guardsman now. My 19 years became 30, and the 30 are nearly done, and one of these winters soon I will stand my last post and hang up the red tunic for a younger man to fill. When that day comes, I will give the young men one charge, and only one, and it is the whole of what a lifetime at the post has taught me, and I will set it down here as I will say it to them then. Stand still, I will tell them. Stand still through the heat and the cold and the insults and the long gray years when nothing happens and nothing is asked of you, but to be the thing that does not move. Stand still, because the realm needs you to be the fixed point it builds itself around, and because your stillness is a gift you give to everyone who passes you and takes comfort, without knowing it, from the sight of a man who will not break. Stand still, until the morning comes, as it came to me, when standing still would mean watching the very thing you guard go under the ice. And on that morning, the one morning in a lifetime, do not weigh it. Do not consult the book. Do not count the cost. Set down your rifle and go. The rule is for the life, and never the life for the rule, and any household worth serving will know the difference in the end, and if it does not, you will know it, alone in the dark with a lamp and a child's letter, and that knowing will be enough to hold you up. I went out onto the ice expecting to die, and I lived, and a prince took the star off his own breast and pinned it to mine with his own 2 hands, and called us even when we both knew we would never be even, not in this life. But the truest thing I carry from all of it is not the star, and it is not the prince's words, and it is not even the boy's letters, precious as they are. It is this, that a man does not, in the end, find out what he is made of by standing still. He finds it out by the one thing he proves himself willing to leave his post for, and I am at peace now at the end of my service, because I know the answer to that question, and it is a good answer, and no board and no record and no cold-eyed earl can ever take it from me. A child's life, that is the answer, that and nothing less and nothing else in all the world. That is what I left my post for. I would leave it again tomorrow. And that, I have come to understand, is the whole of duty, and the whole of honor, and the whole of the thing the red tunic was ever truly meant to mean.